A poor girl finds a billionaire trapped inside a burning car. He screams, "Please, don't let me die here." She tries to save him, but what happens changes her life forever. People never looked down. They hurried along, eyes glued to their phones or the horizon, never noticing the small figure moving among them. To the world, Josie didn't exist. She was just a shadow gliding along the grimy sidewalks of the city. Josie didn't mind. Being invisible had its advantages. The sky still held the last rays of the sun when she arrived at the alley behind the Italian restaurant. It was her favorite spot on Tuesdays. The mustached cook threw away good food, sometimes even whole slices of pizza and pieces of bread that had barely been touched. Lucky day, she whispered to herself, finding half of a lasagna in a bag. It wasn't cold yet. Josie held the treasure in both hands, feeling the warmth against her thin fingers. The smell made her stomach rumble so loudly that she laughed. A small pleasure in a world full of big struggles. Carefully, she tucked the food inside her tattered coat and continued her search. She never took everything at once. Better to spread out her resources, just in case she lost one. Josie had learned this on her own, like so many other things that kept her alive on the streets. As she rummaged through a nearby trash bin, her fingers closed around something round and smooth, a shiny red soda bottle cap. Josie smiled, slipping it into her pocket, along with the others she had collected throughout the week. For anyone else, it was trash. For Josie, it was treasure. The wind tossed her dark hair, making her look up at the sky. Heavy clouds were rolling in, laden with the promise of rain. Josie recognized those signs. It was time to find shelter. Not that cold or rain was anything new. She had lived on the streets for so long that her small body had adapted to the elements. Her coat, 3 sizes too big, had been found in a donation box left at the door of a church. It wasn't pretty. Faded stains marred the dull blue fabric, but it kept her warm when necessary. Josie quickened her pace, crossing the street toward the abandoned subway station. During renovations, workers had left several boxes of equipment in the corner of the east entrance. She had discovered that by stacking 2 of them in a certain way, she could form a perfect shelter from the rain. In her current hideout, Josie kept her small world, a world made of carefully organized soda caps arranged in perfect circles. Each color represented a kingdom in the imaginary map she had created. Crushed cans became buildings and castles. Pieces of colored glass turned into lakes and shining oceans. It was a realm where she ruled, a place where no one could evict her or pretend she didn't exist. The first drops began to fall as she rounded the corner, thick and heavy. They made a loud noise against the asphalt. Josie ran, feeling her heart race with adrenaline. Running was one of the few things she truly enjoyed. It made her feel free, like she could escape anything, even her own reality. The city lights began to glow, reflecting in the puddles that were forming. The world looked different when it rained, cleaner, brighter, as if the water washed away all the grime and sadness. It's going to be a big one, she thought, observing the lightning that heralded the storm. She reached the station just as the rain unleashed its full force. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her soaked sneakers made a funny sound with each step. It didn't matter. In a few minutes, she would be dry enough inside her shelter. Josie rearranged the boxes, making sure water wouldn't seep in easily. She took the lasagna out of her coat and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it were her last meal. Food was one of the few things she could still fully enjoy, maybe because she never knew when the next meal would come. As she chewed, she thought about what it would be like to have a real place. A roof that didn't leak, a bed that wasn't made of cardboard, food that didn't come from dumpsters. Sometimes, when she passed buildings with large windows, she would see families sitting around tables, laughing, talking, everyone together. Josie didn't remember having a father. Her mother was a hazy figure in her memory, cheap perfume, cold hands, broken promises. "I'll be right back, honey. Wait here." Those were the last words she'd heard from her so long ago that it sometimes felt like a dream. She waited for hours, then days. When hunger set in, she began looking for food. When the police showed up, she learned to hide. And so, little by little, the street became her home. The storm ripped through the sky with flashes of lightning followed by thunder. that made the ground vibrate. Josie wasn't afraid. There were far worse things than storms. People, for example. She finished the lasagna and wiped her hands on the edge of her coat. Then she took the caps out of her pocket and began arranging them. Her small fantasy world was the only place where she truly existed, where she mattered. There, she wasn't just a shadow, but a queen, a builder of cities, a person. The rain was falling in dense curtains now, hitting the metal and concrete around her. There was something comforting about the noise, like a sonic blanket that muffled the rest of the world. Josie lay down on her makeshift mattress, made of cardboard and scraps of fabric, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be another day of looking for food and treasures. She was almost asleep when she heard the noise, the screech of tires on wet pavement, loud enough to cut through even the storm. Then the metallic crash, something big colliding violently. Josie sat up immediately. Accidents meant confusion, police, questions. It meant needing to hide even more, but it also meant someone might be in need of help. She hesitated. The rain was strong, and her shelter was dry. It wasn't her problem. The outside world didn't care about her, so why should she care about it? Even so, something made her get up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe that stubborn part of her that still believed people could be good, despite all evidence to the contrary. She cautiously left her shelter, staying in the shadows. The rain was coming down hard, but visibility had improved a bit, enough to see what had happened. A large black car, the kind only very wealthy people drove, had crashed into a streetlight. The front end was completely wrecked, and small flames were beginning to appear under the hood, dancing even through the heavy rain. Josie looked around. The street was oddly empty. No one was running to help. It was as if this corner of the city had been forgotten by the night, by the storm, by fate itself. She crept closer, still hidden by the darkness. That's when she saw the driver, a man trapped in the front seat, moving weakly. The door looked smashed, impossible to open. The flames were growing, fed by something leaking from the destroyed engine. Josie hesitated again. Helping meant being seen. Being seen meant questions, possibly the authorities. Maybe one of those places meant for kids like her. The shelters and foster homes she feared. That was when she heard the shout. A shout that tightened her heart, a sound of pure desperation that cut through the rainy night. "Please, don't let me die here." The man's voice was filled with fear, with a vulnerability Josie knew too well. It wasn't the cry of someone important or powerful. It was the cry of someone who, at that moment, was just as alone and helpless as she was. She took a step back, ready to return to her hideout. It wasn't her problem, it couldn't be. Surviving on her own was hard enough. "Somebody help me, please." His voice was weaker now, muffled by the smoke beginning to fill the car. The flames flared suddenly, lighting up the inside of the vehicle. Josie saw the man's face clearly, wide eyes filled with terror, a trickle of blood running down his forehead. He didn't look powerful or threatening, just scared, not so different from her own face in her nightmares. In that moment, Josie made a decision that would change her life forever. She ran toward the car. The rain pounded her face as she approached. The heat from the flames grew by the second, making the air around her stifling. The man saw the small figure coming closer and looked confused, as though he couldn't believe his eyes. "The door stuck," he managed to say, coughing from the smoke. Josie tried to open it, but it was too heavy, also dented from the impact. She pulled with all her might, her feet slipping on the wet asphalt, but the door wouldn't budge. "It's going to blow," the man muttered, fear clear in his voice. "Run, kid. Save yourself." But Josie didn't run. She looked around desperately. A medium-sized rock lay in the planter near the streetlight. Josie grabbed it with both hands. "Turn your face away," she shouted to the man, who obeyed instinctively. With all the strength she could muster, Josie slammed the rock against the passenger window. Once, twice. On the third try, the glass shattered, disintegrating into thousands of tiny fragments. The heat was now intense, almost unbearable. Josie shielded her face with her arm as she reached through the broken window to get to the man's seatbelt. Her small fingers worked quickly to release the latch. "Can you move?" she asked, coughing in the smoke. The man nodded weakly, dragging himself toward the broken window. Josie helped as best she could, pulling him by the arms. He was heavy and much larger than she was, but adrenaline gave the girl a strength she didn't know she had. "Come on," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You can do it." With one last effort, they made it. The man tumbled out of the car, rolling onto the wet sidewalk. Josie pulled him farther away from the vehicle, her small hands gripping the expensive fabric of his jacket. "Father," she mumbled, hearing the ominous sound of fire eating into the fuel. They crawled a few more feet, away from the crash site. The man coughed, breathing with difficulty, but he was alive because of her. It was a strange feeling for Josie, who had never been needed by anyone before. The car exploded behind them, not like in the movies, with a huge fireball, but with a series of pops and bigger flames that completely engulfed the vehicle. Even from a distance, she felt the heat against her back. The man lay on the sidewalk, gasping for air. Blood dripped from a cut on his head, mixing with the rainwater that washed over his face. His eyes, however, were open and focused on Josie. "You," he began, his voice weak but clear. "You saved me." Josie didn't answer. She was already regretting having helped. People meant complications, meant questions, meant having to explain things she preferred to hide. What's your name?" the man asked, fighting to stay conscious. She hesitated. Giving her name was dangerous. A name meant identity. Identity meant being found, and being found was the last thing she wanted. But something in the man's eyes made her answer. It wasn't the pitying look some adults gave her when they saw her rummaging through trash, nor the look of disgust or fear. It was gratitude. "Josie," she finally replied, her voice almost a whisper amid the rain and flames. The man gave a faint smile. "Thank you, Josie," he said, before his eyes began to close, consciousness slipping away like sand through fingers. In the distance, as sirens, someone had finally noticed the crash and called for help. The sounds were getting closer, cutting through the night like sharp knives. Josie looked at the unconscious man, then at the red and blue lights starting to appear at the far end of the street. She decided she had done enough. In seconds, she'd be surrounded by police, paramedics, people asking questions she didn't want to answer. "Goodbye," she murmured, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The sirens were closer now. Josie took one last look at the man. His black suit was torn and dirty, but it still screamed money. He would be fine. People like him were always fine. They had money, power, people who cared. By the time the first ambulance turned the corner, Josie had already vanished into the shadows, invisible again as she'd always been. The only evidence of her existence were the small, wet footprints that would soon be washed away by the rain. The paramedics found only an unconscious man beside a burning car. As they carried him to the ambulance, checking his vital signs and administering first aid, no one noticed the small figure watching from afar, cloaked in the darkness of a nearby alley. Josie watched as they loaded the man into the ambulance. For a moment, she imagined what it would be like to get into that ambulance with him, go to a clean, warm hospital, maybe receive a formal thank you, possibly even a reward, a place to stay, but she knew it wouldn't be like that. The questions would come, then social services, then she'd just be another lost kid in the system, another statistic. Better to stay invisible. The ambulance left, taking the man to a world Josie only observed from a distance, a world of comfort, security and certainty that she could barely imagine. The sirens faded, leaving only the sound of rain and the distant crackling of the burning car. Josie returned to her shelter, soaked and exhausted. The rush of adrenaline had worn off, leaving her trembling and cold. She lay down on her damp cardboard mattress, pulling a piece of cardboard over herself like a blanket. She closed her eyes, listening to the storm outside. No one ever noticed Josie. That was how she survived. But this time, someone had seen her. Someone knew her name, and that would change everything. Wes Barrett opened his eyes slowly. The bright white ceiling light made his head throb even more. The smell of disinfectant and the steady beeping of machines confirmed what he already suspected. He was in a hospital. He tried to move, but the pain stopped him. His body felt broken in places he hadn't known existed. His right arm was bandaged, and he could feel gauze wrapped around his chest and head. He closed his eyes again, trying to organize the fragmented memories drifting through his mind. The car, the rain, the streetlight, the fire, and then her. "Josie," he whispered, his first coherent thought since waking up. A nurse checking his vitals paused and leaned over him. "Mr. Barrett? You're awake?" "I'll call the doctor immediately." Wes didn't even look at the woman. His mind was fixed on the memory of that small figure in the rain. Dark, wet hair plastered to her face, large, serious eyes that seemed far older than they should be, tiny hands dragging him away from the burning car. "Josie," he repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. The doctor came rushing into the room, followed by 2 assistants. Over the next few minutes, Wes endured questions about how he felt, tests of his responsiveness, and explanations about his injuries. 3 broken ribs, a mild concussion, second-degree burns on his right arm, cuts and bruises all over his body. "You're very lucky, Mr. Barrett," the doctor finally said. "Another minute in that car and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Wes nodded slightly, his gaze distant. "Who found me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He needed confirmation that he hadn't imagined the girl. The doctor exchanged confused looks with the nurse. "Well, according to the paramedics, you were alone when they arrived. Someone must have called 911, but they didn't stay at the scene." Wes closed his eyes again, so she had simply disappeared, melting back into whatever shadows she'd come from, a child on the streets, out in the storm, after saving his life. "I need to make a call," he said, trying to sit up. "Mr. Barrett, you need to rest. Anything business-related can wait. Now." Wes's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. The doctor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Just a few minutes." Once he was alone, Wes picked up the phone and dialed a number that very few people knew. "Grant," he said when the call was answered, "I need you." 3 days passed before Wes had the strength to leave his bed for more than a few minutes. The doctors insisted he stay in the hospital for at least another week, but he knew his own body. More importantly, he knew his mind, and his mind couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Josie. The girl who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared in the same way, leaving only her name and a debt Wes didn't know how to repay. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Grant Riker walked into the hospital room, tall, broad-shouldered, and grey-haired. The ex-military man carried a discreet folder under his arm. His usually impassive face showed a slight frown upon seeing the state of his employer, and Wes liked to think, friend. "You look awful," Grant said, sitting in the chair next to the bed. "Always honest," Wes replied with a faint smile. "What did you find out?" Grant placed the folder on the bedside table and opened it, revealing photos and documents. "Nothing good," he began, his tone professional. "The crash wasn't an accident. Someone tampered with your car's brakes." Wes nodded slowly. Somehow, he'd expected that. "There's more," Grant continued, showing an enlarged photo of the car's door mechanism. The locks were modified. At the moment of impact, they jammed automatically. Whoever did this didn't just want you to crash. They wanted to make sure you were trapped inside when the fire started. Wes felt a chill run down his spine. If not for Josie, he would have burned alive, unable to escape. "Suspects," Grant pulled another photo from the folder. A middle-aged man with carefully combed hair and an impeccable suit. "Richard Linley. Your former partner has plenty of motive. After you kicked him out of the company last year over that embezzlement scandal, he publicly swore you'd regret it." Wes took the photo, studying the face of the man he'd considered a friend for almost a decade. Even after the theft, even after the threats, he never imagined Richard would go that far. "Do we have solid proof?" "We're getting there. I found out he hired a mechanic with a criminal past. We're tracing the payments." Wes handed the photo back, his gaze drifting to the hospital window, looking out at the city below. "Keep investigating," he said finally, "but keep it all quiet for now." Grant frowned, puzzled. "You don't want to hand him over to the police?" "Not yet. I have another priority at the moment." Wes turned to Grant, his gaze suddenly intense. "I need you to find someone. A girl named Josie, a street kid, probably 6 to 8 years old, dark hair, brown eyes. She pulled me out of the car before it exploded." Grant remained silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "A street kid. Saved you. She broke the window with a rock. Dragged me out." Wes touched his bandaged chest unconsciously, as if her name were inscribed there. "I need to find her, Grant. The city's huge, Wes. Thousands of homeless people, many of them kids. It could be like looking for a needle in a haystack." "You've found harder things before." Grant nodded slowly. "I'll need a more detailed description, anything that might help." Wes closed his eyes, trying to recall every detail of that rainy night. She was alone, wore old clothes way too big, seemed adapted to street life. She wasn't scared, even with the fire. "So determined." He paused, remembering her small voice. She didn't say much, but when she told me her name, it sounded like she was revealing a secret. Grant jotted down notes in a small notebook. "I'll start today," he said, getting up. "But, Wes, the city isn't kind to homeless kids. If we find her, what do you plan to do?" Wes looked at his own hands, the scratches and cuts still healing, hands that would be cold and lifeless if not for a girl the world had forgotten. "Help her," he answered simply, "in whatever way she needs." Grant nodded and left the room, leaving Wes alone with his thoughts. Outside, the city continued its frenetic rhythm, thousands of lives following their paths without ever intersecting. Somewhere among the tall buildings and dark alleys, a girl named Josie remained invisible to everyone, but not to Wes Barrett. To him, she was the most important person in the world. 3 days had passed since that stormy night. Josie continued her routine on the streets as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't saved a man's life, as if the name Josie hadn't escaped her lips and entered the world of the visible. Life in the shadows went on. That morning, the sky was clear, with no sign of the storm that had drenched the city days before. Josie woke up early, as she always did. Sleeping too long meant missing the best chances to find food, moments when bakeries threw out yesterday's bread, or when grocery stores separated slightly bruised fruit. Her stomach growled as she walked along the sidewalk, staying close to the building walls. Years on the streets had taught her the art of being invisible. It wasn't just about hiding, but about moving in such a way that people's eyes simply slid past her, as though she were just another piece of urban scenery. "Good morning, young lady." Josie froze at the sound of the voice. It was the man from the corner newsstand, an older gentleman with white hair who always greeted her. He was one of the few people who actually saw her. "Want an apple? It's left over from my snack." She hesitated, then cautiously approached. She took the fruit with a quick motion, without speaking. "You're welcome," the man said with a gentle smile, already used to the girl's silence. Josie bit into the apple as she walked away. It was sweet and crisp, a rare luxury. Usually, the fruit she found was overripe or bruised. As she ate, her eyes landed on the newspapers displayed at the stand. Normally, she paid them no mind. News belonged to the world of the visible, not hers. But today, something caught her eye. A headline in bold letters: "Billionaire escapes death in mysterious accident." Below, a photograph of the destroyed car she knew all too well. The same vehicle she had pulled that man from on that stormy night. Josie felt a chill run down her spine. Billionaire. The man she saved was rich. Very rich. She shouldn't have been surprised. The car was expensive, the clothes too. But somehow, when she saw him trapped in the wreckage, screaming for help, he had just seemed human, scared and vulnerable like anyone else. Josie went on her way, pensive. What would a billionaire do now? Probably go back to his mansion and forget about the accident entirely. Forget about the little figure who saved him in the rain. Rich people didn't care about someone like her, that Josie had learned by watching the city for years. The day passed like so many others. She searched dumpsters behind restaurants, found a few coins near a bank, played with her colorful caps when no one was watching. Her little kingdom grew every time she found a new treasure. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to set, Josie decided to pass through the Central Park. She normally avoided crowded places, but sometimes people dropped leftover food there. Bits of sandwiches, fries, half-melted ice cream. The park was busier than usual. Several people stood still, staring at the giant screen that occasionally displayed news and commercials. Josie stayed off to the side of the crowd, partially hidden behind a trash can. That's when she saw him. On the huge screen, the face of the man she had saved filled the entire space. He was no longer covered in blood and grime. He was clean, with neatly styled brown hair, wearing a dark suit that looked more expensive than anything Josie had ever seen. A small bandage on his forehead was the only visible sign of the accident. A name appeared in white letters at the bottom of the screen: Wes Barrett, CEO of Barrett Industries. Josie stood frozen. It was strange to see that face again, now so composed and in control, so different from the terrified man who had begged not to die. He began to speak. His voice was calm and steady, nothing like the desperate screams from the night of the storm. "I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who showed concern after my accident. The doctors assure me I will make a full recovery." Josie watched, fascinated by the transformation. It was like two different people. "But there's something more important I need to say." The man, Wes Barrett, paused. His gaze seemed to change, becoming more intense, more personal, as if he was no longer speaking to a room full of reporters, but to a single person. "On the night of the accident, when I was trapped in the burning car, someone appeared out of nowhere and saved my life. A child, a little girl." Josie felt her heart race. He was talking about her. "I don't know where she came from or where she went. All I know is her name." The girl shrank further behind the trash can, as if the people in the park might somehow connect her to the words on the screen. "Josie," said Wes Barrett, and something in his voice made her tremble. "Wherever you are, thank you for saving me." There was no sound from the crowd in the park. Everyone watched in silence, probably intrigued by the story of a powerful businessman saved by an anonymous child. "If anyone knows who this little girl is, please contact my office. I want to thank her personally. I want to help her in whatever way she needs." Josie felt heat rise in her cheeks. Help her, that was what people always said before disappearing. Or worse, before sending her to some place where people in white coats asked endless questions. "Empty promises," she whispered, eyes still fixed on the screen. "I won't rest until I find her," Barrett continued. "I owe her my life." Josie almost laughed. A man like that worried about a street kid? Impossible. He'd soon forget, too busy counting money and driving fancy cars. She started to walk away, ready to return to the shadows that sheltered her, when something made her stop. It wasn't his words, but something in his eyes. On the giant screen, the camera had zoomed in on Wes Barrett's face, and there was something there Josie recognized, something that surprised her. It wasn't pity or superficial charity, not even gratitude. It was truth. His eyes, blue and clear on the digital screen, had the same intensity Josie had seen that night when he'd asked her name before passing out. As if even in the midst of pain and danger, he truly wanted to know who she was. Josie stood there, torn between the instinct to flee and a reluctant curiosity that began to grow inside her. On the screen, Barrett continued speaking, now about donations to charities that helped homeless children. But Josie was no longer listening to his words. She was studying the man himself. She'd seen many adults in her short life. Cruelty, indifference, occasional shallow kindness. She recognized masks and lies the way others recognized familiar faces. But that man's eyes, Wes Barrett, were different. As if, for a moment, he too knew what it felt like to be invisible. "Lies," she muttered, turning her back on the screen and walking away from the park. But as she slipped back into the city's shadows, Josie couldn't forget those eyes. That look. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe not. Josie had survived by learning to doubt, and she would keep doubting. It was safer that way. But for the first time in a long while, a small and dangerous feeling bloomed inside her. Hope. Wes Barrett gazed out of the hospital window, looking at the city sprawling below. He was in a private room on the 10th floor, with a view of the skyscrapers he knew so well. Somewhere among those buildings and streets was a girl named Josie, the girl who saved his life, then vanished like smoke. "So where is Grant?" he muttered, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. As if on cue, the door opened, and Sophia, his personal assistant, rushed in. "Mr. Barrett, I'm sorry, but I couldn't locate Mr. Riker. He's not answering his cell or replying to messages." Wes frowned. It wasn't like Grant to be unreachable. "Keep trying," he said, turning back to the window. "And when are the doctors bringing my discharge papers?" "Soon, sir. They still think you should stay a few more days." Wes shook his head. He didn't have time for that, not when he needed to find Josie. The door opened again, and this time it was Grant Riker himself who entered the room. Tall and grey at the temples, his face lined from years of experience, the ex-police officer and now Wes's head of security wore a serious expression. "Where were you?" Wes asked bluntly. "Working," Grant replied simply. He glanced at Sophia. "Could you give us a moment?" The assistant left, closing the door quietly behind her. Grant approached the hospital bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired of lying down. I need to get out of here, Grant. I need to find her." "The girl." "Josie," Wes confirmed. "She saved my life, risked her own for a total stranger, and now she's out there, alone." Grant studied his boss carefully. He'd known Wes Barrett for 15 years, ever since saving him from a kidnapping in Colombia. In that time, he'd watched the young businessman become one of the richest and most powerful men in the country, but he'd never seen him so affected by something or someone. "What exactly do you want me to do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Wes took something from the bedside table, a red soda cap. "Find her. Use any resources you need." "She's small, dark-haired, probably around 6 or 7 years old. She was alone the night of the accident. This cap fell out of her pocket when she dragged me from the car." Grant picked up the small metal piece, examining it closely. "A street kid," he said, more to himself than to Wes. "I need to find her, Grant. I owe her my life." The investigator tucked the cap into his pocket. "I'll start immediately. I'll need details, everything you remember about her, about the exact location of the accident." Wes nodded, and for a few minutes he described what little he could recall from that stormy night. The small figure appearing in the darkness, the rock breaking the window, the tiny hands pulling him away from the flames. "Find her," he repeated, as Grant headed for the door. "No matter how long it takes." 3 days had passed since Grant began his search. The city was vast, with thousands of people living on the streets, many of them children. Finding one specific girl was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But Grant Riker thrived on challenges. He started exactly where Wes had told him, the crash site. The marks were still visible, bits of glass on the sidewalk, tire tracks on the asphalt, the bent streetlight. Nearby, an old subway station closed for renovations. Grant knew the streets well and, more importantly, knew the people who truly saw what went on there. He started casting his net, a series of seemingly casual conversations with those most people ignored. "I'm looking for a small girl. Dark hair. She lives around here," he explained to the owner of a nearby newsstand. The man scratched his beard, thinking, "There is a girl who comes by sometimes. She never talks, but she always looks at the newspapers from a distance and like she wants to read the headlines." "Does she collect anything?" "Bottle caps, maybe?" Grant asked, discreetly showing the red cap. "Now that you mention it, yes. She picks up any caps customers drop. Always really quiet, that kid." It was a start. Grant continued investigating, talking to local shopkeepers, doormen, custodians, invisible people who saw far more than one might think. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Several merchants in the area mentioned the same child, a quiet girl who showed up regularly, always alone, often collecting small items others considered trash. "She comes here every Tuesday and Thursday," said an employee at a local diner. "She never asks for anything, you know, but sometimes I leave a sandwich accidentally outside when I see her." By the third day, Grant had mapped several places the girl frequented. All were within walking distance of the abandoned subway station. His instincts told him that was probably Josie's home, a closed, relatively safe place, sheltered from the rain. He sat on a bench across the street, pretending to read a newspaper while watching the east entrance of the station. The plywood barriers blocking public access had gaps, big enough for a child but not for an adult. On the third hour of his stakeout, his patience paid off. A small figure emerged from a gap in the barriers, glancing cautiously in both directions before darting across the street. It had to be her. Dark, messy hair, clothes far too big for her skinny frame, moving with quick, quiet steps that made her almost invisible to passers-by. Grant resisted the urge to approach her immediately. Instead, he decided to observe her routine for a few more days. He discovered that she left every morning, searched specific dumpsters, visited certain spots where kind shopkeepers seemed to know her, and always returned to the station before nightfall. Most fascinating was how she moved through the city, not exactly hiding, but existing in a layer of reality most people simply didn't notice. It was a skill developed out of necessity, and Grant felt a mix of admiration and sadness as he watched her. On the afternoon of the fourth day, he decided it was time to act. He watched her enter the station around 5 o'clock and waited. 30 minutes later, he approached the same entrance. For him, the small gap between the barriers was too narrow. He circled the building and found a back entrance used by construction workers, secured only by a chain and padlock. For someone with his training, it posed no challenge. In under a minute, Grant was inside the abandoned station. The place was dark and quiet, with rays of light coming through a few broken windows high above. The air smelled of damp concrete and rusty metal. He moved silently, ears alert for any sound. Then he heard it, a soft clinking sound, like something light being placed on a hard surface. Then another clink and another. He followed the sound to the old boarding platform. He stopped in the shadows, observing the scene before him. In a relatively clean area, lit by a narrow beam of sunlight from a broken window, sat Josie. She was completely absorbed in something Grant couldn't see clearly from where he stood. He quietly shifted to the side for a better view, careful not to startle her. That's when he saw what she was doing. Bottle caps, dozens of them, arranged in complex patterns on the floor. Blue, red, yellow, green, forming circles, lines, and arrangements that seemed to have meaning only for her. The girl moved the pieces carefully, sometimes whispering words to herself, as if narrating a story. Grant stood there, transfixed. There was something extraordinary in the concentration of that small child organizing her world of colorful caps. It was as though, for a few moments, she wasn't a homeless girl, but a queen reigning over her own domain. That was when his foot accidentally kicked a loose piece of concrete, causing it to roll noisily across the floor. The girl's reaction was instantaneous. In a second, she was on her feet, eyes fixed in the direction of the sound, body tense like a startled animal ready to flee. "It's all right," Grant said, stepping out of the shadows with his hands visible. "I'm not going to hurt you." To his surprise, Josie didn't run. She stood there, watching him intently, her large, dark eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. There was no obvious fear in her gaze, just a calculated caution that seemed far too mature for someone so young. "My name is Grant," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm looking for someone, a girl named Josie." She didn't show any reaction at the mention of her name, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I came on behalf of a friend of yours," Grant continued, crouching slightly to be closer to her height. "A man you helped on a rainy night, when there was fire." Something flickered across the girl's face, recognition quickly suppressed. "He wants to thank you," Grant said, slowly pulling out the red bottle cap from his pocket. "You dropped this that night." Josie looked at the cap, then at Grant. Her small face remained expressionless, but there was a battle behind those eyes. Trust or flee, believe or doubt. "I don't know any man," she finally said, her voice small and a bit raspy from disuse. Grant nodded, respecting her caution. "His name is Wes Barrett. You pulled him out of a burning car." "You saved his life." Josie didn't reply. Her gaze dropped to the caps on the floor. Grant noticed there was an empty spot in the arrangement, exactly the size of the red cap in his hand. "You have an interesting world here," he commented, looking at the intricate pattern at her feet. "What do they represent?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, surprisingly, She pointed at a group of blue caps. That's the Northern Kingdom, they have the biggest lake. Next, some green caps. That's the Forest Kingdom. They make the best weapons. Finally, she gestured to the empty space where the red cap belonged. That's the Central Castle, where everyone meets to make peace treaties. Grant felt a tightness in his chest. This child, surviving alone on the streets, had created an entire world where lakes, forests, and peace treaties existed, things her real life probably didn't offer. "It's an impressive kingdom," he said sincerely. "May I put this back in its place?" He offered the red cap. Josie hesitated, then held out her hand. Her small fingers closed around the cap quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. Carefully, she placed it into the empty spot in her imaginary realm. "Is Wes Barrett okay?" she asked suddenly, without looking at Grant. "Yes," he replied, "thanks to you. He's rich. I saw it on TV. Yes, he is. Rich people don't care about people like me." The simplicity of her statement, and the certainty in it, made Grant's chest tighten. How many disappointments had this child faced to be so sure of that? "Wes is different," he said carefully. "He asked me to find you because he wants to thank you in person." "Why?" "I only did what anyone would, but no one else did, only you." A silence fell between them. Josie seemed to be weighing his words against everything she had lived and learned on the streets. "You work for him?" she finally asked. "Yes, and I'm his friend too." Josie looked back at her caps, gently nudging one with her finger. "Was it you?" Grant asked, needing direct confirmation. "Were you the one who pulled Wes from the burning car?" For a long moment, Josie didn't respond. She continued organizing her caps as if she hadn't heard him. Grant waited patiently. Finally, without raising her eyes from her little kingdom, she spoke. "Yes, it was me. I just helped." The simplicity of her reply contained a humility many adults didn't possess. For Josie, saving a life was merely helping, nothing extraordinary, nothing worthy of special recognition. Grant slowly took his phone out, making sure not to scare her. "Can I call him now to tell him I found you?" Josie shrugged, a strangely adult gesture in her small body. "If you want." Grant walked a few steps away and dialed. Wes picked up on the first ring. "Grant." "I found her," Grant said simply. There was silence on the other end. Then Wes's voice, more emotional than Grant had ever heard it. "Is she okay? Where is she?" "At the abandoned station. She's safe." And Grant glanced at the small figure on the floor, still immersed in her colorful kingdom. "She's extraordinary, Wes." "I'm on my way," Wes said, ending the call. Wes Barrett got out of the car 3 blocks from the abandoned station. He preferred to walk the rest of the way, using those minutes to gather his thoughts. The doctor had protested his early discharge, insisting he needed more observation. But Wes couldn't wait. Not now that Grant had found Josie. The sky was clear that afternoon, with no hint of the storm that had brought Josie into his life. As he walked, Wes instinctively touched the bandage on his forehead and felt a slight twinge in his broken ribs. Small pains compared to what could have happened. Grant waited on the corner near the station, his usually impassive face showing subtle concern. "How is she?" Wes asked as soon as he got close. "Calm, cautious." Grant paused. "Wes, you need to understand something. She survived alone on the streets. She doesn't trust easily, and for good reasons." "I understand." "No, you don't." Grant's voice was firm. "It's not just about giving her a place to stay or food to eat. She's built an entire world for herself in there, a refuge. We're about to disrupt that." Wes looked at the station's entrance, thoughtful. "What do you suggest?" "Go slowly. Don't make promises you can't keep. And be absolutely honest. She'll know if you're not." Wes nodded. He was used to tough negotiations, to boardrooms where billions were at stake. But suddenly, he felt completely unprepared to meet a 6-year-old girl. Grant led him to the back entrance. "I'll wait out here," he said, unlocking the chain. "She trusts you more than she trusts me. After all, you're the one she saved." Wes entered the station alone. The contrast between the bright sun outside and the dim interior made him blink a few times. The place smelled of damp concrete and rusted metal. His footsteps echoed softly as he walked down the main corridor. "Josie," he called, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. He followed Grant's directions toward the old platform. As he approached, he noticed a faint beam of light entering through a broken window high above. That's when he saw her. Sitting on the cold concrete, surrounded by colorful bottle caps arranged in complex patterns, was Josie. She seemed even smaller than Wes remembered from the night of the accident. Her dark hair was messy, and her clothes, an oversized coat and faded pants, swallowed her thin frame. Wes stopped a few feet away, not wanting to invade her space. "Hello, Josie," he said gently. She lifted her head, and their eyes met. Even in the dim light, Wes recognized those eyes immediately. Large, dark, with an intensity not typical of a child so young. The same eyes that had met his on that stormy night, while she pulled him from the flames. "You're the man from TV," Josie said, her voice small and slightly hoarse. "Yes, my name is Wes." He took a careful step forward. "Your friend Grant said I could come in." "He's not my friend," she corrected quickly. "We just talked." Wes nodded, accepting the distinction. "May I sit down?" Josie shrugged, a gesture he interpreted as permission. He lowered himself onto the floor, keeping a respectful distance. His ribs complained, but he ignored the pain. For a moment, they were silent. Wes observed the intricate arrangement of caps in front of him, impressed by its precision. "Did you make all this?" he asked. Josie nodded, looking at her creation with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. "They're the 5 kingdoms," she explained simply. "It's amazing," Wes said, genuinely meaning it. There was something deeply moving about how this child had created an entire world from what others would consider trash. Another silence settled between them. Wes knew he had to proceed carefully. This wasn't a corporate deal where he could control the situation with well-chosen words or calculated offers. "Josie," he finally began, "I want to thank you. You saved my life that night," the girl continued, looking at her caps. "Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. Only you." Wes paused. "May I ask you something? Where are your parents?" Josie's face grew even more guarded, a shadow passing through her eyes. "I don't have a dad," she replied curtly. "And your mom?" Josie picked up a blue cap, turning it over in her fingers before answering. "My mom left me, said she'd be right back. She never came." The plainness of her statement, without pity or drama, hit Wes like a punch. How many nights had this child waited for someone who never returned? How long until she realized she was completely alone? "How long ago?" he asked softly. Josie shrugged again. "Lots of moons." Wes understood she probably couldn't measure time accurately. It might have been months or years. "And where do you live?" "Besides here." "Different places. Depends on the rain, on the cold." She lifted her eyes to him, a touch of defiance. "I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can," Wes replied sincerely. "You're very smart and brave, braver than many adults I know." Something in the compliment seemed to catch Josie off guard. Perhaps she wasn't used to being recognized for her abilities, only judged for her circumstances. Wes glanced around the cold, damp space she called home. A few boxes were stacked in one corner, forming a kind of shelter. A piece of cardboard covered with old fabric served as a bed. Nearby, a torn backpack held what he guessed were all her worldly possessions. Something inside him broke. This child had risked her own safety to save him, and here she was, alone, sleeping on the cold floor of an abandoned station. "Josie," he said carefully, "you saved my life, and you don't deserve to live like this." The girl looked at him with distrust. She'd likely heard empty promises before. Wes took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. "I have a big house with an empty room. There's hot food, clean water, and a safe place to sleep." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Would you like to come with me?" Josie frowned, confused and cautious. "Forever?" The question caught Wes off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He was acting on instinct, which was rare for a man who usually calculated every business move. "For as long as you want," he answered honestly. "If you don't like it, you can leave, I promise." Josie looked at her small kingdom of caps, then at the torn backpack in the corner. Can I bring my things? Of course. Anything you want. She thought for another moment, her young face serious like a judge weighing a complex case. If I don't like it, you'll bring me back here. My word, Wes promised, surprised by the intensity of his own commitment. Josie got up and began gathering her caps carefully, placing them into a small tin she pulled from the backpack. Then she packed her few belongings. When she finished, she stood in front of Wes, the battered backpack on her shoulders, looking simultaneously very young and very old. Wes stood slowly, feeling a twinge in his injured ribs, and held out his hand. Ready? Josie studied his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, she placed her small hand in his. The touch nearly made Wes falter. Her hand was so tiny, the fingers so delicate, yet at the same time her grip was firm and determined, a hand that, despite her age, had learned to take care of itself. Together, they walked out of the abandoned station, leaving behind the makeshift shelter Josie had called home. Grant was waiting outside, his normally stoic face softening slightly at the sight of the girl holding Wes's hand. Everything okay? Grant asked, mostly directing the question to Josie. She nodded, her expression serious. As they headed to the car, a light rain began to fall. Wes noticed Josie glancing worriedly at the sky. Don't worry, he said. We'll be home before the rain gets worse. Home. The word sounded strange even to him. His penthouse had never really felt like a home, more like a place to sleep between business trips and endless meetings. Now, suddenly, he was bringing a child there. In the car, Josie sat quietly, eyes wide as she looked around. Her small hands clutched her backpack on her lap, as though someone might try to take her few possessions. Grant drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the two in the back seat. Wes could tell his friend was still worried, probably wondering if Wes truly understood what he was doing. Honestly, he didn't, but he knew it was the right thing. When they arrived at the luxurious building where Wes lived, Josie looked up in awe at its height. The doorman opened the car door, greeting Wes with a polite smile, barely concealing his surprise at the sight of a ragged little girl beside him. In the elevator, Josie stayed close to Wes, her eyes now more cautious. The wealth around her seemed to intimidate her more than life on the streets ever had. Is this where you live? She asked when the elevator stopped at the penthouse. Yes. And now you do too, if you like. When they entered the apartment, Sophia, Wes's personal assistant, was waiting. Wes had called her on the way, giving a brief explanation of the situation. The middle-aged woman, usually focused on spreadsheets and meetings, now looked at Josie with warmth. Welcome, she said, careful not to get too close. You two must be hungry. Josie didn't reply, partially hiding behind Wes. Why don't we show her around first? Wes suggested, sensing the girl's tension. He led her through the spacious apartment, pointing out the living area with its huge windows offering a panoramic view of the city, the modern kitchen he barely used, and his office filled with books. Finally, they reached the guest room. This can be your room, Wes said, opening the door. The space was simple yet elegant, decorated in neutral tones, with a large bed in the center. For Wes, it was just a barely used guest room. For Josie, it seemed like a palace. She entered tentatively, looking around as if expecting someone to yell that she didn't belong there. She placed her tattered backpack on the floor by the bed, a stark contrast to the room's decor. Can I sit on the bed? She asked, her voice small. The question made Wes's heart clench. Of course. It's your bed now. Josie approached cautiously, touching the soft comforter with her fingertips, as if testing whether it was real. Then, slowly, she sat on the edge. Her feet dangled, not reaching the floor. It's soft, she remarked, almost to herself. Sophia appeared at the door, carrying some neatly folded clothes and fluffy towels. I thought you might like a warm bath, she said, placing the items on a nearby chair. And these clothes should fit until we can buy some others. Josie eyed the clean clothes with a mix of longing and mistrust. We'll let you get settled, Wes said. The bathroom is there. He pointed to a door inside the room. It has hot water. Use as much as you want. He and Sophia left, quietly closing the door behind them. In the hallway, Sophia looked at him with an expression that was both surprised and approving. "She really saved your life." "Yes," Wes replied simply. "And she has no one." "No one," Sophia nodded, understanding the situation without needing more details. "I'll make something for her to eat." After she left, Wes paused outside Josie's room before going to his own. He listened to the sound of water running. Something inside him, a part he hadn't known existed, felt like it was thawing. 20 minutes later, Josie emerged. She was unrecognizable. Her dark hair, now clean, fell in damp waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple t-shirt and pants that, while still a bit large, were clean and intact. Her face, free of dirt, revealed pink cheeks and faint freckles on her nose. In the kitchen, Sophia had prepared a simple meal: hot soup, fresh bread, and some fruit. Wes watched as Josie sat at the table timidly, her eyes wide at the sight of the food. "Go ahead and eat," he said gently. "There's more if you want it." Josie ate slowly and carefully, as if each spoonful was too precious to waste. Wes noticed she only finished half the soup before stopping. "Aren't you hungry anymore?" he asked. Josie glanced at the plate, then at Wes, clearly conflicted. "We can save it for later," Sophia said, understanding immediately. "I'll put it in the fridge for you." Relief was visible on Josie's face. Wes realized she was rationing her food, a habit from never knowing when her next meal would come. Later that evening, as darkness fell over the city, Wes found Josie sitting on the edge of her bed, looking out the window at the city lights below. She still hadn't gone under the covers, as if unsure whether she was allowed to use the bed. "Time to sleep," he said softly. "It's been a long day." Josie nodded but didn't move. "Is everything okay?" Wes asked. "It's just so big and soft." Wes understood. A king-size bed probably felt as foreign to her as sleeping on concrete would feel to him. "Do you want me to leave the hallway light on, so it's not too dark?" Josie nodded, appearing relieved by the suggestion. "I'll be in the room down the hall if you need anything. Just call." She looked at him for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of the offer. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "Good night, Josie," Wes answered, resisting the urge to come closer. He knew instinctively that hugs and goodnight kisses were still far off in the future. He left the door slightly ajar and turned on the hallway light, as promised. On his way to his own room, he stopped briefly to speak with Sophia, who was getting ready to leave. "Do you think I did the right thing?" he asked, keeping his voice low so Josie wouldn't hear. Sophia, who had known him for years, offered a gentle smile. "I think you both needed this, Mr. Barrett." After she left, Wes stopped by Josie's room before retiring. He peeked through the gap in the door and saw that she had finally slipped under the blankets. She lay in the middle of the huge bed, appearing incredibly small between the white sheets. What surprised him was what he saw next to her. On the pillow, carefully arranged, were her colorful caps, organized in the same intricate pattern he'd seen in the station. Her little kingdom, rebuilt in new territory. Wes smiled to himself. Josie didn't fully trust him yet. Perhaps she never would. But she was trying. She was watching. She was giving this new life a chance. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since Josie arrived at Wes's penthouse. 3 weeks of adjustments, discoveries, and daily small victories. Her world, once limited to alleys and dumpsters, now included her own bedroom, regular meals, and the constant presence of Wes and Sophia. At first, Josie slept on the floor beside the bed, wrapped in a blanket. Wes found her that way every morning, but never commented. He simply smiled and wished her good morning. On the 7th night, she finally slept in the bed, a small step, but significant. Food was also a delicate issue. Josie continued hiding pieces of bread and fruit under her pillow, preparing for the days of scarcity her mind still feared. Sophia noticed, changed the sheets, washed everything, and never said a word. Gradually, those hidden stashes of food became fewer. On that sunny Saturday morning, Wes was on the balcony drinking coffee and answering emails. He had drastically reduced his workload in recent weeks, delegating as much as possible to be around Josie. It was a radical change for a man who used to work 16-hour days. Josie appeared silently, as she always did. Despite the comfort of her new home, she still moved like a shadow, a habit hard to break after so long on the streets. "Good morning," Wes said, smiling at her. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, sitting in the chair next to him. She was wearing a blue t-shirt and shorts, new clothes Sophia had bought. Her dark hair, now clean and shiny, was tied in a simple braid Sophia had taught her. "There's orange juice in the fridge," Wes offered. "Want me to get it for you?" "I'll get it," Josie replied, standing up. Another small victory. During the first weeks, she rarely served herself, as if afraid to take something without permission. Wes watched as she went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and carefully poured herself some juice. Her movements were still precise, no wasted motion, a leftover survival tactic from the streets. She returned with her glass and sat down again. "What do you want to do today?" Wes asked. "It's a beautiful day," Josie shrugged, looking at the city skyline below. "Anything." It was still difficult for her to express preferences or desires. Wes was learning to recognize the small signs, the way her eyes lit up at certain things, how she relaxed a bit in certain settings. "We could visit the aquarium," he suggested. "Or the Central Park. There's a lake there with ducks." Something changed in her expression, a subtle spark. "Ducks. Yes, we can bring bread to feed them, if you like." Josie nodded, trying to hide her excitement. But Wes noticed. He was learning to read her subtle expressions. Her silent language developed for survival. As they finished breakfast, Sophia arrived with some documents Wes needed to sign. The assistant had naturally taken on a maternal role for Josie, teaching her how to braid her hair, pick out clothes, and do small household tasks. "Good morning, Sunshine," Sophia said, using the nickname she'd given Josie. The girl didn't smile, but her eyes softened, her equivalent of a warm greeting. Sophia placed the papers on the table, along with a drawing pad and a box of colored pencils. "I thought you might like these," she said casually, as if it was no big deal. Josie eyed the supplies curiously, but didn't touch them right away. Wes saw her hesitation. She was still wary of gifts, as if they might vanish at any moment. "Go ahead, give it a try," he encouraged, gently sliding the drawing pad toward her. "Sophia told me you made a beautiful sketch yesterday." The day before, while Wes was in a video conference, Sophia had given Josie some pencils and paper. The girl had drawn a series of colorful circles that she later explained represented her bottle cap kingdoms. Josie finally picked up a blue pencil and began scribbling on the pad. Wes and Sophia exchanged quick looks of approval and then focused on the documents they had to review. For nearly an hour, they worked in silence while Josie drew. Occasionally, Wes glanced at her, noting her intense concentration, the tip of her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she worked. When they finished reviewing the documents, Sophia said her goodbyes, promising to return the next day. "Have fun at the park," she added, smiling at Josie. Wes put the papers away and looked at Josie, who was still drawing. "May I see what you're making?" She hesitated, then moved the pad away, revealing her creation. However, she hadn't drawn on the pad. She'd used a paper napkin on the table. Wes was surprised. The drawing was simple, with childlike lines, but extremely expressive. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands in front of what looked like a house with a triangular roof and a chimney releasing smoke. A bright yellow sun shone in the upper corner, and colorful flowers dotted the yard. It was Wes and Josie, a house, a family. Something tightened in Wes's chest. He tried to speak, but found the words wouldn't come easily. It's lovely, Josie," he finally said. She regarded the drawing critically. "The roof is crooked." "No, it's perfect," Wes said, lightly touching the napkin. "Did you ever have a house like that? A place of your own?" Josie shook her head. "Only in my head." 3 simple words, containing a world of loss and longing. Wes felt his heart ache again. What was it like to grow up without a place to call your own? No security, no warm bed, no one waiting for you at the end of the day. Wes picked up the napkin carefully, stood, and left the balcony without explaining. Josie watched him go with a neutral expression, but her eyes followed him intently. In his office, Wes opened a drawer and took out an old leather planner. Between its pages, he kept photographs and important documents. Gently, he placed Josie's napkin drawing between the pages, smoothing it so it wouldn't crumple. When he returned to the balcony, Josie was still seated, sipping her juice, seemingly indifferent. But Wes noticed how her eyes darted to his empty hands, noting that he hadn't thrown away her drawing. He said nothing about the napkin. He didn't mention that he'd placed it among his most valuable possessions or how deeply it had touched him. Instead, he smiled and said, "Shall we get ready to see the ducks?" Their day at the park was calm and pleasant. Josie was fascinated by the ducks, though she kept a serious expression as she fed them. Wes observed how she made sure to distribute the bread evenly, including to the smaller ducks that lagged behind. Afterward, they walked around, pausing to watch a group of kids playing ball. Josie watched them with a mix of curiosity and caution. When one of the children waved, inviting her to join, she hid partially behind Wes. "You don't have to play if you don't want to," he said gently. "I don't know how," she replied, eyes still on the kids. "I could teach you another time if you want." She nodded, and they kept walking. Wes noticed how she looked at other families, parents and children holding hands, piggyback rides, laughter. A world she had only observed from the outside, like looking through a storefront window. On the way home, they stopped at an ice cream shop. Josie chose chocolate but ate only half before asking to save the rest. "We can always come back and get more," Wes explained gently. "I still want to save it," she insisted. Wes understood. Old habits were hard to break. For Josie, conserving resources was a deeply ingrained survival instinct. That evening, after dinner, they sat in the living room watching a documentary about marine animals. Josie was captivated by the colorful images of tropical fish and coral reefs. Wes made occasional comments, explaining interesting facts about the creatures. When the program ended, it was time for Josie to go to bed. This part of the routine was already well established. A bath, brushing teeth, clean pajamas, and a story read by Wes before sleep. As he tucked her in, Josie looked thoughtful, her large eyes fixed on the ceiling. "What is it?" Wes asked. "Is something bothering you?" Josie was quiet for a moment, as though gathering courage. "Do you have a family?" she asked finally. The question took Wes by surprise. In all the weeks Josie had lived with him, they'd never really talked about his past. "My parents died a long time ago," he answered honestly. "I have no siblings." "But you're rich," Josie said, frowning. "In stories, rich people always have families." Wes smiled at the childlike logic. "Real life is sometimes different from stories." "You never had kids?" "No." Wes paused, wondering how much to share. He decided on honesty. Josie deserved it. "I never had children, never got married." "Why not?" "I guess I was too busy, building companies, making money. I never stopped to build a family." Josie took this in, her face serious as she processed it. "So you're alone?" It wasn't a question, but a statement, and its simplicity hit Wes deeply. Yes, he had been alone, even when surrounded by employees, partners, acquaintances. He agreed softly. Then, after a pause, he added, "But if you want, we can be one." "A family, I mean." Josie's eyes widened, shining in the dimly lit room. For a moment, Wes worried he'd gone too far, too quickly. Perhaps she wasn't ready for such a commitment. Then Josie did something she had never done before. She sat up in bed and hugged him, her thin arms wrapped tightly around his neck with surprising strength, as though she feared he might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "No one's ever wanted me before." Wes felt overwhelming emotion rising in his throat. Gently, he hugged her back, conscious of her fragile little body in his arms. He wanted to say so many things, that she was special, that she deserved love, that he would protect her always. But words felt inadequate, so he simply held her, letting the embrace convey what words could not. When she finally pulled away, there was suspicious moisture in both their eyes. "I think I'll like having a family," Josie said, her voice small but determined. "Me too," Wes replied, adjusting the blanket around her. "Me too." He turned off the light, leaving only a small lamp on, just how Josie preferred. At the door, he turned to look at her once more. The girl was already lying down, her eyes closing as the day's fatigue caught up with her. On the nightstand beside the bed, Wes noticed she'd arranged her colorful caps in a new pattern, a perfect circle, like a sun or maybe a family. He closed the door softly and headed to his office. There, he opened the drawer and took out the planner where he'd stored Josie's drawing. He gazed at the two stick figures holding hands in front of a crooked roof house with a smoking chimney. That napkin contained more than a simple child's drawing. It was a wish, a dream, a hope, and it was a promise Wes intended to keep. A routine gradually established itself in Wes Barrett's penthouse. At 7:30, Sophia arrived and prepared breakfast. At 8 Wes emerged from his room, impeccably dressed, even on days he worked from home. Josie usually appeared a few minutes later, quiet as ever, her bare feet almost soundless on the wooden floor. On mornings, Wes had to go to the office. He explained he'd be back in the afternoon. "Sophia will stay with you," he would say, and Josie would nod, her serious face hiding any emotion. Early on, he noticed how she checked the clock constantly while he was gone, as if timing how long before he returned, testing whether he really would keep his word. He always came back. On this particular morning, Wes had an important meeting he couldn't postpone. Some big expansion project, the kind that would normally consume all his attention. But as he drove to the office, he found himself thinking more about Josie than about the numbers he'd have to present. "Are you sure you're all right?" asked Andrea, his vice president, when he got distracted for the third time during the meeting. "Perfectly," he answered, forcing himself to refocus on the discussion. When he returned to the penthouse at the end of the day, he found Sophia in the kitchen preparing dinner. "How was her day?" he asked, as he always did. "Good," Sophia replied, chopping vegetables. "We watched a documentary about the oceans. She asked a few questions about whales." She paused, "and she drew a lot today." Wes smiled. Since discovering Josie's talent for drawing, he'd encouraged it, providing quality materials, even though she still preferred napkins and scraps of paper to the expensive sketch pads he bought. "Where is she now?" "In her room, organizing those bottle caps." Wes nodded. Josie's kingdom of bottle caps had been transferred from the abandoned station to her new room, where it occupied a special spot on the rug. Sometimes she spent hours rearranging them into patterns only she understood. On the kitchen counter lay a sheet of paper that caught Wes's eye. It was different from her usual scribbles, more elaborate, more colorful. He moved closer to see better. It was a drawing of the view from the penthouse, the city skyline in simple but recognizable lines, with the sun setting behind the buildings. In the center of the drawing, on the balcony he recognized as theirs, were two figures, one tall, one small, side by side. The quality was surprisingly good for a 6-year-old. There was attention to detail, the exact color of the sky at dusk, the different sizes of the buildings, even the balcony plants were represented. But what touched Wes most was the closeness of the two figures. They weren't holding hands like in the napkin drawing. They were simply side by side watching the city, sharing a moment, existing comfortably in the same space. "She left it there before going to her room," Sophia said, noticing his interest. "She didn't say anything, just put it down and walked away." Wes touched the paper gently. "It's incredible." "She's got talent," Sophia agreed. "But I think it's more than that. It's how she processes everything." Wes studied the drawing a moment longer. Then he made a decision. "I'm going to say good night to her," he said, taking the drawing. "Dinner can wait a few minutes." He found Josie just as Sophia had said, sitting on her bedroom floor organizing her caps. It was a ritual that seemed to give her comfort and a sense of control. Wes watched her from the doorway for a moment before knocking softly. "May I come in?" She looked up and nodded, her dark eyes as observant as ever. Wes entered and sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disrupt her kingdom on the floor. "I saw your drawing," he said, holding up the paper. "It's really beautiful." Josie didn't reply, just studied the drawing in his hands with a neutral expression. "I'd like to do something special with it, if that's okay," Wes continued. "What?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her reserve. "I want to frame it. Hang it in the living room so everyone can see." Something flickered in Josie's eyes. Surprise or confusion. "Why?" It was a simple question, but loaded with meaning. Why would anyone want to display something she made? Why would her drawing deserve a place of prominence? "Because it's important to me," Wes answered honestly, "and because you're talented." Josie looked at her caps, then back at Wes. "You can do what you want with it," she finally said, in a tone that tried to sound indifferent. But Wes noticed how her small fingers nervously spun a red cap, one of the signs of emotion he was learning to read. "Thank you," he replied simply. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes." As he left the room, Wes already knew exactly what he would do. Early the next morning, while Josie was still asleep, Wes made a phone call to Martin Shaw, the owner of the best art gallery in town, and, coincidentally, a major admirer of Wes's collection of contemporary pieces. "Martin, I need a favor," Wes said when the man answered. "I have a very special artwork that needs framing today. Is that possible?" "Of course, Wes, bring it in and we'll take care of it immediately." Wes placed Josie's drawing carefully in a portfolio and left before she woke, leaving a note for Sophia explaining he'd be back by lunchtime. At the gallery, Martin examined the drawing with professional interest. "A recent acquisition?" he asked, curious. "You could say that," Wes replied with a small smile. "She's an emerging artist with a lot of potential." Martin nodded, sensing the importance of the request without asking further questions. "What kind of frame do you have in mind?" "Simple, elegant, something that won't overshadow the drawing itself." Together, they chose a slim, dark wood frame with a white mat that highlighted the drawing's colors. Martin promised it would be ready in a few hours. When Wes returned home late in the morning, carrying the perfectly framed drawing, he found Sophia and Josie making cookies in the kitchen. The sight surprised him. Josie had flour on her nose and looked almost relaxed as Sophia showed her how to cut the dough into circles. He hid the framed piece behind his back, out of sight. "Looks fun," he commented, stepping into the kitchen. Josie glanced up, instantly trying to see what Wes was hiding. "What's that?" Sophia asked, noticing his posture. "A surprise," he replied, smiling. "Finish the cookies first." While they returned to baking, Wes slipped into the living room. He surveyed the walls, deciding where it would look best. Finally, he settled on the main bookshelf, where he kept his most treasured books and a few framed photographs. He removed an old photograph of himself accepting his first major business award and put Josie's drawing in its place, right in the center at eye level, impossible for anyone to miss when they entered the room. He stepped back to admire the effect. The drawing, now professionally framed, didn't look like a mere child's work. It had presence and dignity, belonging there as much as any expensive artwork he owned. Lunch went by normally, with Josie eating in her usual silence, only speaking when asked a direct question. Wes noticed she kept glancing his way, still intrigued about the surprise. When they finished, Wes cleared his throat. "Josie, I want to show you something in the living room." She followed him, her footsteps light on the floor. Sophia came along, smiling slightly. She'd guessed what Wes had done. In the living room, Wes simply pointed to the bookshelf. "Over there." Josie looked where he indicated, and for a moment she stood perfectly still. Her eyes widened slightly, the only visible sign of surprise on her usually controlled face. Slowly, she walked up to the shelf and stood in front of her framed drawing. She didn't speak, she didn't smile. But she lifted her hand and touched the frame with her fingertips, an almost reverent gesture. Wes and Sophia exchanged glances, sharing a moment of mutual understanding. Neither spoke, afraid to break the spell. Josie stayed there, gazing at the drawing for nearly a full minute. Her finger traced the edge of the frame, then lightly touched the glass over the two figures watching the sunset. When she finally turned around, something in her eyes had changed, a certainty that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of understanding. For the first time since she arrived, Josie seemed to truly believe she had a place. In the following weeks, that framed drawing was gradually joined by others. Josie began drawing more often, and Wes had each piece framed with care whenever she allowed it, Little by little, an entire wall of the living room became a personal gallery, a visual timeline documenting not just her artistic growth, but also her increasing sense of security. The pictures got brighter and more detailed. The figures, whom Wes and Sophia quietly recognized as the three of them, appeared in various scenes, feeding ducks in the park, baking cookies in the kitchen, browsing books in a store. During this time, Wes made an important decision. His experience with Josie had opened his eyes to a reality he'd never truly grasped before: the plight of homeless children. At a meeting with his legal and financial departments, he announced the creation of the Barrett Foundation for At-Risk Children. The project, he explained, would begin by completely renovating 3 local children's shelters and implementing educational and mental health programs. "I want top-notch facilities," he instructed his surprised staff. "Comfortable beds, nutritious meals, art and reading spaces, and above all, staff who genuinely care." The executives exchanged baffled looks. This wasn't the Wes Barrett they knew. The man focused solely on profits and expansion, but no one questioned him. The tone in his voice allowed no debate. 6 weeks later, the first renovated shelter was ready for inspection. Wes decided to take Josie with him. "I want you to see something important today," he said over breakfast. Josie looked at him curiously but asked no questions. That was still her way: watch, absorb, await. In the car on the way to the shelter, Wes explained in simple terms what he was doing. "Remember the old subway station where you used to live?" he asked gently. Josie nodded, her expression unreadable. "There are many kids like you who don't have a place to call home. So I'm trying to help them." "How?" "By creating places where they can stay. Safe places, with food and beds." Josie absorbed the information in silence, looking out the car window as the city blurred past. Wes wasn't sure if she fully understood, but he sensed it was important for her to be included. The renovated shelter was unrecognizable compared to the rundown building it used to be. The facade was painted in bright colors, with a small garden at the entrance. Inside, everything was new: furniture, appliances, toys, books. The director, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Barrett, it's an honor." "And who is this young lady?" "This is Josie," Wes replied simply, not elaborating on their relationship. The formal adoption process was still making its way through the complicated legal system. "Welcome, Josie," said the director, crouching to meet her eye level. "Would you like to see our new art room? We have lots of drawing supplies." Josie glanced at Wes, who nodded encouragingly. She followed the director, keeping a careful distance. For the next hour, they toured the fully renovated shelter. Wes talked with staff, made notes about minor adjustments, and ensured everything met his specifications. Josie trailed quietly behind, her observant eyes taking in every detail. In the dormitory, Wes noticed how she stared at the rows of beds, each with new mattresses, colorful sheets, and a small chest for personal items beside it. So different from the cardboard she'd once slept on. When they got back to the car, Josie seemed thoughtful. Wes respected her silence, as always. They were almost home when she finally spoke. "Will the other kids get beds too?" The question surprised Wes, not for its content but for the implied concern for others. "Yes," he answered, feeling a surge of emotion. "They will now." Josie turned to the window again, but not before Wes caught something rare and precious, a slight smile at the corner of her mouth. It was a kind of victory she understood, not about money, power, or prestige, which were abstract to a child who'd struggled just to survive. It was about concrete, tangible things: a safe place to sleep, a meal on the table, someone who cared. When they arrived home, Josie went straight to her room. Half an hour later, she emerged with a new drawing in hand. Without a word, she handed it to Wes. It was the shelter, with several little stick figures out front, children holding hands with adults. A bright yellow sun shone overhead, and in the blue sky was a single word written in childish letters: "Thanks." Wes felt a lump form in his throat. "Can I frame this one too?" he asked, his voice slightly shaky. Josie nodded, and for the second time that day she smiled, a small, shy smile, but real. That night, after Josie went to bed, Wes stood in the living room, looking at the wall now lined with her artwork. From the simple sketch of two figures watching the sunset to the vibrant representation of children finding safety. The progression was clear. It wasn't just the art that was growing. Josie was growing too, and Wes recognized with some surprise so was he. Morning light shone in a clear blue sky, contrasting with the tense mood inside Wes Barrett's penthouse. In 3 hours, he would give his first official press conference since the accident. Journalists wanted details about the attempt on his life, his recovery, and the rumors about the little girl now living with him. Wes adjusted his tie for the third time, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The visible scars from the accident had practically faded, but he still felt an occasional twinge in his ribs when he moved too quickly, physical reminders of the night that changed everything. The intercom buzzed. Sophia answered and informed him Grant had arrived. "Send him up," Wes instructed, giving himself one last look in the mirror. Josie was in the living room, sketching in her new notebook. Over the past few weeks, she had developed a morning routine, breakfast with Wes, then drawing or reading while he worked on emails. It was a normalcy neither of them had ever imagined months ago. "Good morning, sunshine," Grant said as he walked in, using the nickname Sophia had coined and everyone had adopted. Josie didn't reply verbally, but lifted her eyes for a moment, silent acknowledgement that, for her, was almost a warm greeting. "We need to talk," Grant said, his tone indicating it wasn't for Josie's ears. Wes nodded. "Sophia, could you stay with Josie for a moment? We'll be in the office." Sophia, who was arranging flowers on the dining table, smiled. "Of course." "Hey, sunshine, want to help me make those chocolate cookies you like?" In the office, with the door closed, Grant laid a folder on the desk. "The final report," he said simply. Wes sat down, opening the folder with a calm that didn't reflect his inner tension. Over the past weeks, Grant had been running a detailed investigation into the sabotage, parallel to the official police inquiry. "The attempt was orchestrated by Richard Lindley, your ex-partner," Grant said as Wes began reading. "He's already in custody. The police caught him last night trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands." Wes took the information in without surprise. In a way, so he had expected it. Richard Lindley had been his business partner for nearly a decade, until Wes uncovered that he was embezzling company funds, firing him, and the ensuing scandal had destroyed Lindley's reputation. "He hired a mechanic with a criminal record to tamper with the brakes," Grant continued, "and modified the door locks to jam upon impact. He wanted to ensure you were trapped when the fire started." Wes took a deep breath, flipping through the detailed report. Photos, statements, bank records. The evidence was damning. "If not for Josie," he said, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Exactly," Grant agreed. "Lindley never counted on a street kid appearing out of nowhere to save you." Wes closed the folder and got up, walking over to the window. Below, the city moved on, oblivious to the drama playing out in that penthouse. "What are you going to say at the press conference?" Grant asked. "The truth," Wes said simply. "But I'm not really here to talk about Lindley today." A light knock on the door interrupted them. Sophia entered, looking a bit worried. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. Josie is nervous about the press conference. She didn't say so directly, of course, but she's asked 3 times if she has to go with you." Wes exchanged a glance with Grant. "Thank you, Sophia. I'll talk to her." He found Josie in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of milk untouched in front of her, her large, serious eyes locked on him as soon as he entered. "Hey," he said softly, sitting across from her. "Sophia told me you're worried about the press conference." Josie shrugged. That gesture Wes knew so well, her attempt to appear indifferent when something truly bothered her. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he reassured her. "In fact, I'd prefer you stay here with Sophia. There will be a lot of cameras and people asking questions. It's not a pleasant place. But you're going to talk about me," she said. Not as a question, but a statement. Wes nodded. "Yes. People are curious. They want to know who saved me that night. And also," he paused, carefully choosing his words, "I want to tell them about what we decided, that you're my daughter now. If that's okay with you." Josie took this in silently, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. "They'll want to see me afterward." The perceptiveness of her question didn't surprise Wes. Josie always had an understanding beyond her years. "Probably. Some reporters will ask for interviews, photos, but we won't do anything you don't want to." "I promise." Josie nodded slowly. "Okay, you can tell them." Wes smiled, recognizing the trust implied in those simple words, a trust earned day by day. 2 hours later, Wes faced a sea of cameras and microphones in the Barrett Industries auditorium. The flashes popped incessantly as he stepped up to the podium, accompanied by his lawyer and Grant, who stood discreetly to his right. "Good afternoon," Wes began, his voice steady through the speakers. "Thank you for coming. As you know, I'm here to discuss the incident that nearly took my life 2 months ago." The cameras kept flashing as he gave a brief account of the accident. Then, with calm composure, he announced, "The investigation is complete. The attempt was planned and executed by my former partner, Richard Linley, who is now in police custody. I won't go into the motives or legal details, as that's for the courts." A murmur spread through the crowd. Journalists raised their hands, eager with questions, but Wes lifted his own for silence. "The perpetrator has been identified and will be dealt with by the law. But today, I want to focus on what gave me the strength to go on." The room went silent, everyone focused on his words. "On the night of the accident, when I was trapped in a burning car with no hope of survival, something improbable happened. A child, a 6-year-old girl living on the streets, risked her own life to save mine." Wes paused, emotion tightening his throat. It wasn't part of the carefully prepared PR statement. It was genuine. "Her name is Josie, and in the weeks following my accident, as I recovered, something extraordinary happened between us, something neither of us expected." Another silence, deeper this time. Even the photographers seemed to take fewer pictures, as if captivated by the story. "Josie, the girl who saved me, is now my daughter. The adoption was finalized last week." Wes smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his usually serious face. "And that's what I'm most proud of." The journalists erupted in questions now, but Wes only answered the most relevant ones. No, Josie wasn't present. Yes, she was adjusting well. No, he wouldn't allow interviews with her at this time. "My priority is her well-being and privacy," he stated firmly. "I hope everyone respects that." When the press conference finally ended, Wes was exhausted but satisfied. He had said what needed to be said, making it clear that Josie was now part of his life, not as a charity case or a PR project, but as his daughter. "So you handled that very well," Grant commented in the car on the way home. "It was easier than I expected," Wes admitted. "Once I started talking about Josie, the rest just came naturally." At home, Sophia greeted them with the news that everything had gone smoothly. Josie had spent the afternoon drawing and helping bake cookies, apparently without anxiety. "She watched a bit of the press conference on TV," Sophia said quietly. "She got very quiet when you mentioned the adoption." Wes found Josie in the living room, sitting on the sofa with her sketchbook. She looked up as he entered, her eyes studying him as they always did, searching for any sign of change or potential danger, a habit that might never fully disappear. "Hey," he said softly, sitting beside her. "How was your day?" "Normal," she replied, closing the sketchbook. "I saw you on TV." "Really? What did you think?" Josie shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "You looked important." Wes laughed. "Well, the only important thing I said was about you." He stood and went to his office, returning moments later with something in his hands, a silver frame to match the others on the bookshelf. "I have a surprise," he said, handing it to Josie. It was a photo of the two of them, taken by Sophia the previous week during a trip to the park. In it, Wes and Josie sat on a bench looking at each other. Wes had a broad smile, and Josie showed one of her rare smiles, small, still hesitant, but undeniably real. "I thought we could put it over there," Wes suggested, pointing to the shelf that displayed his most important awards. Business trophies, industry recognitions, photos with influential people. Together they walked over to the shelf. Wes moved some items to make room at the center, right next to his most prestigious honor, Entrepreneur of the Year from 5 years ago. "How does that look?" he asked, after positioning the photo. Josie was silent, gazing at the shelf. There she was, her image preserved in an elegant frame, placed among Wes's prized possessions, not hidden away, but front and center. Important. Slowly, she reached out and touched the frame tenderly, her fingers tracing the silver edge. When she turned to Wes, there was a smile on her face, bigger and more assured than any he'd seen before. "I like it," she said simply. To anyone else, it might have seemed a reserved response. But Wes knew Josie well enough now to recognize the depth of feeling behind those simple words. It was more than approval, it was acceptance, belonging. The photo on the shelf was more than just an image, it was a statement. Josie Barrett now had a permanent place, a name, a family, a home. And for a girl who had spent her life being invisible, that meant everything. The school uniform had been waiting in the closet for 3 days, grey pleated skirt, white blouse with the Westbrook school emblem embroidered on the pocket, a navy blue cardigan for cold days, white socks carefully folded in the drawer, black shoes polished beside the bed. Wes checked everything every night, as if afraid it might vanish in his sleep. On the morning of the big day, he woke before the alarm, 5:30 a.m. He spent a few minutes staring at the ceiling, feeling a nervousness he hadn't felt since his first major business deals. Getting Josie accepted at Westbrook Academy hadn't been easy. Even with his resources and influence, there were hurdles. No previous school records, incomplete medical history, the inevitable gaps in the development of a child who had lived on the streets for years. "She's exceptionally bright," Wes had insisted during the final interview with the principal. "She just needs a chance." The principal, Mrs. Montgomery, had examined the drawings spread across her desk. Detailed urban landscapes, expressive figures, vibrant colors telling wordless stories. "I agree," she finally said, after a long evaluation. "We'll start with individual assessments, then gradually integrate her into regular classes." In the kitchen, Wes prepared breakfast with extra care: scrambled eggs, buttered toast, freshly squeezed orange juice, the kind of meal a dad would make for his daughter on her first day of school. The word still echoed strangely in his mind. In official documents, newspaper headlines, conversations with lawyers and social workers, he was now legally Josie Barrett's father. At 6:40, he heard light footsteps in the hallway. Josie appeared at the kitchen door, already dressed in the full uniform. Her dark hair still messy despite an obvious attempt to comb it. Her eyes, usually guarded, seemed bigger today, anxious. "Good morning," Wes said, trying to keep a casual tone despite the knot in his stomach. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded and sat at the table, her feet in pristine white socks swung above the floor. "Sophia will be here in 15 minutes to help with your hair," he mentioned, serving the orange juice. "I tried myself," Josie said, running her hand over her unruly strands, "but it didn't work." "It looks fine," Wes said, smiling. "But Sophia's better at that than both of us put together." When Sophia arrived, she brought a small wrapped present with colorful paper. "For you, sunshine," she said, handing it to Josie. "A little good luck charm for your first day." It was a small golden sun brooch, delicate and shiny. "To pin on your cardigan," Sophia explained, "so you remember you always shine, even on cloudy days." Josie touched the brooch carefully, as if afraid it might break. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice small but clear. Sophia transformed Josie's wild hair into a neat braid, then pinned the brooch on the navy blue cardigan, placing it over her heart. "Perfect," she declared, stepping back to admire her work. "You look beautiful, sunshine." Grant drove them to school because Wes admitted he was too jittery to drive. In the back seat, Josie clutched her brand new backpack, blue with silver stars, tightly on her lap, as if it were a shield. Outside the car window, the same city passed by, the city where she once roamed unseen, collecting bottle caps and surviving day to day. Westbrook Academy, with its green lawns and red brick buildings, presented a stark contrast to her past. Children in identical uniforms converged at the entrance, some excited, some sleepy, all clearly belonging to something bigger. Wes and Josie walked up the stone path toward the main building. Other parents watched them, some openly curious. The story of Wes Barrett and his adopted daughter had been on magazines and newspapers in recent weeks. At the entrance to the elementary wing, the teacher was waiting. A middle-aged woman with a kind smile and keen eyes. She briefly explained how the day would go. Light assessments, integration activities, nothing too overwhelming for a first day. "I'll be with her the whole time," she reassured Wes. "We'll take it step by step." The moment of goodbye had come. Wes knelt to look Josie in the eye. For a second, he saw in those dark eyes the same girl who'd found him on a stormy night, risking it all to save a stranger. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Josie nodded, her fingers tightening around the straps of her backpack. Then, just as she was about to follow the teacher, she paused. She turned back to Wes, and for the first time she asked the only question that mattered: "Will you be here when I come out?" That question held entire worlds. It wasn't just about this day or this school. It was about trust, promises, the future. It was about all the times adults had vanished from her life before. "Always," Wes answered, his voice steady despite the emotion in his throat. "I promise." Josie studied him for another second, as if gauging the truth of that promise. Then, surprisingly, she stepped forward and hugged him. A quick, almost shy hug, but a hug all the same. Without looking back, she followed the teacher through the glass doors. Wes stayed there, watching until the small figure in uniform disappeared inside. But his eyes no longer saw the terrified child of the streets, the one who hid in the shadows, invisible to a world that chose not to see her. Now he saw Josie Barrett, a girl with a name, an identity, a sense of belonging. A child who drew colorful worlds and fed ducks in the park. A student about to discover libraries, labs, friends, and endless possibilities. She was invisible no longer. She was his daughter. And in that lay two salvations, hers and his own. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.